the 30 Years' War, which raged across Central Europe. From 1618 to 1648 is one of the most devastating and complex conflicts in world history. Though it started as a religious war between Catholic and Protestant states within the Holy Roman Empire, it soon expanded into a brutal political struggle involving most of the great powers of Europe. The war's horrors weren't limited to the battlefield. Civilians suffered through unimaginable atrocities, torture, pillaging, mass rape, and widespread starvation. This was not a war of clean battles and glorious victories. It was a grinding, filthy, and slow descent into chaos that left Central Europe in ruins. Among the most horrific consequences of the war was the mass starvation that swept across entire regions, leaving millions dead or reduced to eating grass, bark, or even human flesh to survive. This article explores the 30 Years' War with a focus on the grim famine and starvation it caused, the reasons behind it, and its devastating impact on populations and future European society. The origins of the war. A powder keg explodes. The war's spark was religious in nature. The Holy Roman Empire, a loose collection of semi-independent states under an emperor, was religiously divided. Protestantism had spread rapidly after Martin Luther's Reformation, but the Catholic Church and the Catholic Habsburg monarchy wanted to suppress it. In 1618, tensions exploded in Bohemia, modern-day Czech Republic, when Protestant nobles threw two Catholic emissaries out of a window in an event known as the Defenestration of Prague. Though the emissaries survived, the act was a direct challenge to imperial authority. It marked the beginning of the Bohemian Revolt, the first phase of the 30 Years' War. What followed was not a short, contained conflict. Instead, over 3 decades, the war metastasized into a continental struggle involving Sweden, France, Spain, Denmark, the Dutch Republic, and numerous German principalities. Armies swelled in size, loyalty wavered, and ideology gave way to chaos and greed. Civilians were trapped between roving mercenary armies with no rules and no mercy. The horrors of starvation, death by 1,000 hungers. One of the most infamous legacies of the 30 Years' War was the mass starvation that ravaged Europe, especially the German states. The war did not occur in isolation from the people, it destroyed them from within. Many regions saw population drops of 30–50%, not primarily from combat, but from famine, disease, and the scorched earth tactics of armies. The destruction of farms, theft of livestock, burning of granaries, and contamination of water sources turned fertile lands into wastelands. Entire villages were erased not by bombs, but by empty bellies. Some of the key factors contributing to the starvation were 4 sieges and blockades. Cities and towns that tried to resist were placed under siege. With trade routes blocked and supplies cut off, hunger turned to desperation, and desperation turned to madness. The Cannibal's Diary, When Morality Fails. One of the most chilling testaments to the famine of the 30 Years' War comes from journals and court records of the time. In one recorded case from 1630 in a Bavarian village, a mother was found to have killed her own infant and boiled the flesh for soup. She was arrested and confessed under torture, though it's unclear if her confession was true or a product of desperation and coercion. But the story was not unique. Reports of cannibalism, grave robbing for bones, and the boiling of leather shoes for broth were frequent. Priests wrote in their diaries of walking through towns and finding people crawling in the mud, too weak to cry, too starved to stand. Some regions, such as Württemberg and Palatinate, lost up to 75% of their populations, much of it due to famine-related causes, child mortality and the collapse of family life. Children were the most vulnerable. Infant mortality skyrocketed during the war. Mothers with no milk, no food, and no medical care often buried multiple children before the war ended. In some towns, schools were shut for decades, and whole generations grew up without any form of education or stability. Orphans roamed the countryside in packs, begging for food, sometimes turning to theft and prostitution just to survive. Women, often widowed or raped by soldiers, had little means of protecting themselves or their children. The social fabric of entire regions was torn apart, and with hunger always pressing, even familial bonds could be stretched to breaking. A deathly silence, the ghost villages of Germany. One of the most haunting effects of the war is still visible in the landscape of Central Europe. Travelers during the war and afterward described passing through mile after mile of abandoned farms, burnt churches, and empty houses. The phrase deserted lands became a common entry in tax records. In parts of Germany, over 2,000 villages ceased to exist. In some areas, it took over a century for population numbers to return to pre-war levels. Even after peace was declared, the land remained traumatized. Crops didn't magically grow again, and trust between neighbors didn't instantly return. Bandits, former soldiers, and the mentally broken roamed the countryside for decades. The war economy, profit from pain. Amidst this devastation, a war economy flourished. Arms dealers, corrupt generals, tax collectors, and war profiteers grew rich off the endless cycle of destruction. Some city-states thrived by supplying mercenaries, weapons, and food, only to fall into ruin themselves when war finally moved into their territory. Peasants, on the other hand, bore the cost. They were taxed into oblivion to fund the war, conscripted into armies, or simply driven from their homes. In many areas, peasants preferred living in the forest like animals to risking another encounter with marauding troops. The end of the war. Peace without justice. The war finally ended in 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia, a series of treaties that redefined European politics and sovereignty. The agreements ended the era of religious wars in Europe and established the principles of statehood and diplomacy that are still in use today. But for the millions who died from hunger, the peace came too late. And for those who survived, the trauma remained for generations. Many chroniclers of the time believed they had lived through the apocalypse, and in a sense they had. Legacy of the Starvation. What the 30 Years' War taught us. The 30 Years' War wasn't just a war of swords and pikes, it was a war of starvation. It taught future leaders the horrifying cost of prolonged warfare without rules or compassion. It became a case study in what happens when civilian lives are deemed expendable. It also changed the very landscape of warfare. The notion of mercenary armies was discredited. National standing armies began to emerge, funded and maintained by the state, with clearer rules of engagement. International laws about warfare, civilians, and sovereignty found their earliest roots in the ashes of this conflict. Yet, in many ways, history repeated itself. World War I and II would see starvation used again as a weapon. But the 30 Years' War remains unique for how total and indiscriminate its destruction was, especially when measured by how many lives hunger took, not steel or gunpowder. The 30 Years' War is often remembered for its religious roots, diplomatic consequences, and political reshaping of Europe. But behind the treaties and timelines lies a darker truth. This was a war of starvation. It turned fertile fields into killing grounds and thriving towns into empty ghost villages. In the end, the war's legacy isn't just one of battles lost or won, it's a lesson in unchecked cruelty, in the horror of ignoring the human cost of conflict. And most importantly, it's a warning of what happens when the world forgets that every war touches the innocent more than the powerful. Let us not forget that sometimes the most brutal weapon of all isn't a sword or cannon, but an empty bowl.